Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please take your seats at this time as the program will begin momentarily.
Desktop research and secondary research. Starting to understand your research in context. So what is desktop research? You can start your research journey on several starting points. Going to the library, using a search engine, starting to look in online databases. A lot of the questions at the beginning are around defining your terms and collecting examples of related work. This is a basic exercise to, on the one hand, learn about the methodology, but also understand your topic at hand. So, a classical definition of secondary research, you can see here from Wikipedia. So secondary research involves the summary, collation, and/or synthesis of existing research. Secondary research is contrasted with primary research, in that primary research involves the generation of data, whereas secondary research uses primary research sources as a source of data for analysis. So an important point is you try to understand the existing body of knowledge and existing evidence at hand and try to classify that, identify gaps. And of course, for that, you need to understand the terms that are spoken in the research field specific to your research question and study. So what does it mean to understand the context and identify these terms, and what is important about it? Let me give you an example also. We worked a lot on augmented reality. So starting questions are, why is it important to perform this research? What are we expecting? What kind of new insights is it that we want to understand? What has not yet been explored? You can also start from the areas when you look at technologies where these technologies have been applied already. Is there proof that these technologies work? Or is there any other kind of evidence to understand your research domain and your research field? So when we stick with the example of augmented reality, defining the terminology, you will be confronted with articles looking at augmented reality, virtual reality. You can collect examples where people try to experiment with different types of applications of the technology. And you should probably approach these also considering the added value and motivation behind augmented reality and what was the purpose that these experimenters, the researchers actually originally had. So also exploring the context will help you to understand the current state of the technology, what is possible, what is not possible, and so on. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are many starting points for desktop research. But where should you start to look? So, first of all, the important step is finding different sources of information. So, identify a range of sources. Identify different sources you could make use of and use different type of queries. So just experiment with the terms you start your journey with and type them in a search engine and identify the number of hits you find and try to combine different search queries. So also use simple search queries, combinations of that. We come to that also a bit later. Another important issue is to keep record of your results. Keep a logbook. You can do this in a simple text document. You can do it in a more advanced spreadsheet. You will also see examples of that, but it is important to document your journey because for later on in the publication, this data is very valuable also to see how your terminology developed, and you can use that in your publication. So in that sense also, if you come across milestone conferences with a lot of citations, important publications, also for you personally. Keep them in your log file. And do iterations about that. So regularly revisit your log file, your documentation, and reflect on the terminology you're using and if this is the appropriate terminology. So, if necessary, revise your terms and relate to the sources where you found these definitions. So, there is, as said, a variety. You can start in dictionaries, search in Wikipedia, use search engines. Typically, if you have a more scientific approach where you know already there is an existing body of evidence and an existing body of research, go to your library catalog. You will find selected areas and indices for different areas. So also in some domains, it's very valuable to look at venues, conferences held about the topic, because this is also state-of-the-art research regularly that is only accepted to these venues. So conference proceedings are definitely a very good starting point also to understand your domain at hand. So search terms. I come to that in more depth also in the literature review, but as I mentioned before, work with simple and or more complex searches. So combine and or not queries, and we will see an example of that later on. Work with different keywords. Typically start to search for title, keyword, abstract. So you don't do a full text search because that becomes much more complex. Do a quick scan and take short notes on findings that strike you. So, and iterate about your results as mentioned before. I give you one example of some also additional information you can get from these queries and searches. I stick with the domain of augmented reality. So this is a search from Google Scholar. Interesting observations you can make is by how many authors has an article been cited. So you see the first one, a survey of augmented reality, has been cited 11,000 times, which is actually a pretty high number, depends on the domain, of course. It's already also from 97. Okay, there are different versions of that, but that's definitely seems a milestone paper to understand your topic. And then you have specific applications in education in this case, or other applications. So a lot of review studies help you at the beginning also to understand your domain. Second, in some cases, it's really interesting to look at the distribution of publications over the years, which also comes back in your literature review then. So for example, here you can see that a lot of publications have been done already in 2017. If you would go back in time, probably you would see increasing numbers as the topic gets more popular, but sometimes you also see wave distributions of hype cycles going back and forth on a topic. So distribution over time, this is from Scopus. You can definitely get some interesting insights. And last but not least, and I mentioned that in the sources, venues are important. So to define the terminology. Here you can find an international symposium on augmented reality. You see different application domains and workshops on those. And it definitely makes sense to look at the summaries and overviews of these conference publications, conference proceedings, to understand what is going on considering the state of technology. Last but not least, be aware when you search for terms of a bubble. So also use probably different search engines. You might find it very interesting when you search terms and you use the same search terms in different search engines. Also be aware of when you're logged into certain tools as Google. Of course, your profile determines also what you will find. So use also locked out searches where you don't have a specific user profile with your history. That can give you really new perspectives on the topic. So, to sum up, think about the purpose. What is it what you're actually searching for? And I come back to that later on. Try to understand the terminology, the state of art, and the context of application where your research topic has been applied. Use databases, Google, and be aware of the bubble. Use different search engines. So search for simple terms and complex combinations of terms. And last but not least, very important, document your explorations in a logbook and regularly reflect on your logbook. I wish you success.